She was never named in Scripture, not in Genesis, not in church, but she was there, born from the same dust, wept under the same stars, bled into the same soil. They called her daughter, but not with love. She was given, taken, used, then forgotten. In ancient Mesopotamia, a girl is led by priests to the altar. She's told it's holy, that her blood will seal the land. Behind her eyes, silence. She is Eve's daughter, but no one will say her name. This is not about Lilith, not about Eve. This is about the ones who came after and were never meant to be remembered. Women born before kings. Women sold as bloodline insurance. Women married to their brothers in sacred contracts. Women whose children were buried because they weren't male. From forbidden tablets to apocryphal gospels, this is the story the book won't tell you. The daughters of Adam and Eve, and the brutal truth behind how early religion, patriarchy, and bloodlines made them vanish from memory. Because forgetting wasn't an accident. It was a weapon. If you enjoy watching and learning about history, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible how we can explore history together from all around the world. In the beginning, there was Adam, then Eve, then Cain, Abel, Seth. But something's missing. Genesis chapter 5 says, after he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. Daughters, unnamed, unnumbered, unimportant, at least to the scribes. They were there from the beginning, born in the same mythical Eden, raised alongside their brothers. But their names? Erased. Their stories? Never told. Because the earliest histories of humanity weren't meant to be neutral. They were written in priestly hands, for male inheritance, under patriarchal eyes. The Bible gives us Cain and Abel. But how did Cain have children? Who did Seth marry? Ancient Jewish and Christian thinkers ask the same question, and the answers are chilling. The Book of Jubilees, an early Jewish text excluded from the Bible, gives names to some of Adam and Eve's daughters. Cain married his sister Awan. Seth married Azura. They were sisters and wives, born not out of love, but necessity. Not remembered for who they were, but for what they enabled. Male bloodlines. Even in ancient commentary, these daughters are acknowledged only when needed to justify male lineage. No stories. No legacy. Just wombs. And that silence wasn't an accident. Across Mesopotamia, early Sumerian and Akkadian tablets tell of priest kings born from divine women, goddesses or priestesses used in rituals of fertility. But even there, names were erased, reclassified as temple prostitutes or sacred concubines. In early Abrahamic tradition, as monotheism hardened, the role of women narrowed, from co-creators to companions, from prophets to temptresses, from leaders to mothers and only mothers. The daughters of Adam and Eve were once central to early origin myths across cultures. But when religion began to control inheritance, temple rights, and political legitimacy, those women had to be written out. Their names threatened the chain. Their agency complicated the theology. Their stories humanized what was meant to be myth. So they were buried, under edits, translations, and centuries of silence. But even silence leaves fingerprints. The daughters are in the margins. In apocrypha.org. In forgotten scrolls. In the gaps between names. They were there. And they were erased. It wasn't an accident that Cain married his sister. It was, by design. In ancient religious systems, purity didn't mean moral cleanliness. It meant bloodline control, the preservation of divine, royal, or sacred lineage. And the earliest daughters of humanity were tools of that system. In Genesis, Cain kills Abel. He is exiled, yet a few verses later, he has a wife and a son. But where did she come from? The Book of Jubilees answers bluntly. Cain married his sister Awan. Seth married his sister Azura. Incest was not taboo. It was mandatory. To preserve the purity of the original human seed, daughters were bred with their brothers. No consent. No romance. Just bloodline logic. This wasn't unique to biblical tradition. In ancient Egypt, royal daughters were routinely married to their brothers, even their fathers, to keep the line divine. Pharaohs claimed they were descendants of gods, but the real gods were women forced into incestuous unions to protect dynasties. In Sumer, priestesses called Entu were ritually purified through controlled sexual rites to produce heirs tied to temple land. In Zoroastrian tradition, early myths spoke of xwwduda, next of kin marriage, as holy. It was everywhere. The myth of the pure womb created the forgotten first daughters, girls whose entire existence was reduced to one thing: reproduction under control. They weren't lovers. They weren't queens. They were wombs with names left out. This didn't end in the ancient world. These ideas echoed forward into Christian Europe, Islamic law, and royal dynasties worldwide, where women's bodies became property of the bloodline, and marriages were made to maintain power. Even the Virgin Mary was defined by her reproductive role, not her voice, not her thoughts. Her worth was in her closed womb, a theological purity enforced by silence. But the daughters of Adam and Eve were never virgins. They were given away, assigned, bred into forgotten corners of early religion, and then cut out of the canon. Their names were erased not because they weren't important, but because they were too important to be left uncontrolled. And that's the dark truth. The foundations of sacred history were built on forced incest, stolen consent, and the disappearance of every woman who couldn't be controlled by Scripture. We remember Abraham and Isaac, a father nearly sacrificing his son, stopped by God, praised for his faith. But we forget something older, something darker. Before boys were nearly sacrificed, girls were. Across ancient Canaan, Mesopotamia, and Israel, the bodies laid on the altar weren't just sheep or sons. They were daughters, young, virgin, and expendable in the eyes of the divine. And the Bible never outright forbids it. In Judges 11, a man named Jephthah makes a vow to God. If you give me victory in battle, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes from my house. He wins. He returns. And the first thing to greet him? His only daughter. She dances toward him, joyful, innocent. He weeps, but he doesn't stop. She asks for one favor: 2 months in the mountains to mourn her virginity. Then she returns. And he kills her. Scripture never condemns him. It simply says, he did to her as he had vowed. She is not named, not saved, not remembered, except as a footnote in a war story. Why? Because in early religion, female life was a form of currency, a gift to the gods, not as warriors or leaders, but as offerings. In Ugaritic temples, archaeologists have found small bones, often female, often young, buried beneath foundations. In Carthage, urns filled with the cremated remains of infant girls were labeled MLK, linked to ritual death. In ancient Israel, the prophet Ezekiel warns of making your children pass through fire. But it happened, and the victims were often girls, because male heirs were valuable. Female children were expendable, the ultimate proof of loyalty to a god who demanded control. This pattern echoes through stories left untold. The daughter of Herodias used to demand John the Baptist's head. The girl taken by King David after Bathsheba's first child dies. The unnamed concubine in Judges 19, raped, dismembered, and mailed to Israel's tribes like a message. These aren't just stories of violence. They are stories of purposeful forgetting, where women's death sanctified covenants, where silence became holiness, where pain became theology. The daughters of Adam and Eve were not protected by the garden. They were led to altars built by men, sacrificed for victories, for bargains, for the illusion of divine favor. And their voices? Burned away, like the smoke that rose from their bodies. But why would such a story even exist? Because deep beneath official scripture lies a different memory. A world where women had power, where they were partners, not property. Lilith became a threat not for her sexuality, but for her independence. And she wasn't the only one written out. Because history doesn't need to burn your body to erase you. It just needs to stop saying your name. After centuries of silencing, controlling, and rewriting the feminine story, something devastating happened. Women began to believe it. They memorized stories where Eve caused the fall. They sang hymns to a God who only called men. They were taught that silence was obedience, and obedience was salvation. And they passed it down, mother to daughter, prayer to prayer. This is the inheritance of silence. It's not just in theology. It's in memory. The book of Proverbs warns, a wise woman builds her house, but a foolish one tears it down with her own hands. But who defined foolish? Who said wisdom was silence, humility, invisibility? Over time, women began to associate power with punishment. To question was to sin. To speak was to tempt. To lead was to threaten the divine order. And the psychological toll of this is immeasurable. In trauma studies, this is called learned submission, when victims internalize the logic of their captors, when they begin to enforce silence on themselves. It's why generations of women shamed their own daughters. Why girls were warned to obey, not understand. Why stories of the feminine divine were laughed off, even by women. Because forgetting becomes a habit, and silence becomes a virtue. But buried beneath that silence is pain. Pain that echoes through. The absence of female prophets. The disappearance of priestesses. The shame in sexuality. The horror of birth made unclean. The centuries of worshipping a god who never looked like you. Women inherited not just religion, but the trauma of being left out of it. And it wasn't just imposed, it was inherited. Not because women were weak, but because the system was brilliant. Erase a name, and she's forgotten. Erase a voice, and she's ignored. But teach a woman to fear her own power, and she'll stay silent forever. This is not myth. It's how the daughters of Adam and Eve were transformed from sacred origin into silent vessel. And that silence still shapes the world we live in. They tried to erase them. They burned their names, twisted their stories, silenced their voices. But silence is never perfect. It cracks. And through those cracks, the daughters return. Across time, across continents, fragments survive. The whispers of Eve's other daughters in Gnostic scrolls. The trace of Lilith in lullabies and nightmares. The shadows of priestesses buried under patriarchal temples. The scarred but enduring wisdom passed down by women who were never allowed to write. And now, memory is becoming rebellion. Because to remember a forgotten woman is to break a chain. To say her name, Azura, Awan, Noria, Sophia, is to defy every scribe who buried her. To imagine her voice is to spit in the face of every priest who claimed she had none. The daughters of Adam and Eve aren't lost. They were taken. But women remember in other ways. They remember in ritual, in birth, in resistance, in the quiet refusal to forget. In West Africa, griots, oral historians, preserved entire bloodlines through song. In indigenous America, matrilineal tribes passed land, power, and story through daughters. In early Christianity, women risked death to smuggle banned gospels, not for theology but for truth. Today, the act of remembering these daughters is no longer passive. It is active. It is violent, against the lie. Because the truth is this: Adam and Eve had daughters. They were powerful. They were sacred. They were sacrificed. And their absence shaped civilization more than their presence ever could. But now, we speak them back into existence. Not just as footnotes. Not just as wives or sisters, but as origin, as defiance, as the first victims and the first rebels. They were never gone. They were just waiting. In ashes, in altars, in lost gospels, and bloodlines, for someone to remember. And now that you have, you'll never look at, in the beginning, the same again.